really is a delight to be here. I've lived most of my life just a few miles north of here in Manitoba, Canada, and other parts of the west, so the weather feels about right. And it's the same kind of prairie conditions that I've been used to. So I live in Ottawa now, but it's always nice to be back in this part of the world, and especially with IATP. We've worked with and cooperated with for the entire life of IATP and our life as well, almost the same age, I think. I must say I really like the way we started off the conversation with Ben, and all the discussion on the agriculture certainly fits into that as well. It is this network, this connection between climate and trade, and I would say as well technologies, that we have to try to understand better in looking at agriculture. And it strikes me as urgent that we do that. We can't let it lag longer than it has. So much is happening so quickly. We're always hearing about Moore's Law and how fast that's changing things. And in the biosciences, they argue, I'm not sure it's true, but it's still argued that the pace of change is about 5 times that of Moore's Law. So about every 5 or 6 months, the speed at the ability to synthesize DNA, the cost of synthesizing DNA drops so rapidly that what was unimaginable 3 or 4 years ago becomes easy today. And we can talk about things like CRISPR technologies, which I won't even bore you with the details, but we can talk a little bit about some of the detail, but where 3 years ago it didn't exist, where the thought of moving and trying to really change, even with synthetic biology, trying to change a variety or a species slightly, adapting it, modifying it slightly, was expensive and dubious as to how well you could do it, very hard to do well, and again, costly. Now, the ability to actually make about 50 different, very precise changes in the DNA of the species, to make a recessive gene, in fact, a dominant gene, to be able to take something which is of no benefit to the species and spread it out into not only that species, but perhaps wild relatives of that species. The things that can be done at a cost where you can actually buy the system on how to do that on eBay for $130 now. So it's doable. And it's being done, which is even the more shocking thing. So it's not just a matter of a theory, the pace is just phenomenal. And while there'll be glitches to it, all kinds of problems, it won't work particularly very well, it still is going to be a factor in our lives and have a big impact on what we're able to achieve in agriculture and what will work against us in agriculture. So that sense of pace of change has to be with us. And that sense of pace and change has to be with us in the context of the changes in the climate. And it leads us to, and I'm sure most people around the table have at least read or looked at Naomi Klein's book last year, or at the end of 2014, This Changes Everything, looking at climate. It's a good book. I really highly recommend it to you. If you got depressed after the first 30 or 40 pages, it's worth going through to the end because there's a lot of optimism really in the text as well. But the book of hers that I think is even more relevant to climate is the one she wrote before that, which was Shock Doctrine, looking at the economic changes that were created in the shock of economic crisis and trade crisis and so on, how it was possible to manipulate governments in radically different ways than one would have expected. And I think that's the kind of environment we're in now with climate change. There is a shock doctrine aspect to this, which I think industry is using very well for its purposes. Climate is real, change is real, but the ability to galvanize governments into doing things they wouldn't otherwise do, into accepting intellectual property protection systems they wouldn't otherwise accept, into accepting ridiculous technologies such as geoengineering that they would not otherwise logically want to consider, is happening. And that also is putting on a pressure that has to be considered. And within that context of the climate pressures demanding instant quick changes, and the technology is moving very quickly as well, is this absolutely dark monster beneath that, which is the trade issues, which are lurking there, manipulating that background to that, defining for us what can and can't be done really, not being fully aware of that. Again, trade not being discussed in Paris. That's an alarming world to be in when those factors are moving about and not being properly understood. It's interesting, I'm part of a group established by Olivier de Schutter, the former special rapporteur on the right to food last year, which is looking at different food system issues, and IPIS Food is called. And Olivier and the group we identified just recently our first three products are going that we thought we had to get out to the international community about agricultural issues, food and agricultural issues. The first product is going to be on diversity. The second product is going to be on agroecology. And the third product is going to be on innovation and technology. And the underlying theme of all three draft papers so far, which I think are coming very close together in places, the underlying themes for those are the trade issues and the climate. They're just givens. There isn't one on climate and agriculture because we thought that's just everywhere. It's absolutely integral to our thinking. There's not one on trade precisely because that's absolutely integral to how we look at these other questions. And the discussions around how we handle those three issues is to me, really fascinating as to the level of agreement among quite a diverse group of people around the table in fighting over the actual text is much higher than I would have expected. And our sense of alarm, again, over the pace of change is intense on these topics. Several ways this could be moving in the next year or two. I would kind of want to argue that 2016 is going to be the year of agricultural biodiversity. It's going to become a much more important topic during the course of this year than it has for a very long period of time. I'd say 20 years, in fact. We are going to see this year, because of the negotiations around climate-smart agriculture, which may still become a bigger and bigger discussion as we go through the processes coming out of Paris and going towards Marrakesh at the end of this year. Climate-smart agriculture will become more prominent. It is, again, always in the background. It's always there. There must have been 100 side events on climate-smart agriculture going on. Well, I'm exaggerating a bit, but in Paris there's a lot of side events discussing it, and it's an important part of the conversation. There's going to be a lot of conversation this year because of the biodiversity conventions processes as well. Agriculture is a big part of the biodiversity process, which ends in Cancun in, again, December of this year. There's a lot of work going on around agricultural biodiversity questions, more precisely because of the work being done by the FAO Commission on Genetic Resources, which will have a major sort of multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral report at the end of this year, which will be debated next year, but it'll be out this year, focusing not on ownership and control questions, but still there. We're also going to see, with all the talk about mergers now taking place in the agricultural input side of the system, I think it's going to be very hard to avoid, I hope it's hard to avoid, a huge conversation about where is this going, where is this concentration going, where will it end up at the end of the day. So it's moving, again, I get up early every morning to read all the press that I can because I wouldn't be at all surprised if one of the mergers didn't get announced literally during the night. It's happening, there are changes every day. Where that leaves us, I think, is trying to understand how the shock doctrine applies to this for the agricultural sector, is saying that if you guys want to survive climate change, and also survive changes in trade agreements for that matter, then you're going to need sets of new technologies to get us through that. And those technologies require huge investments in capital, very high risk research, and they require the kind of scale and the kinds of intellectual property protection that we haven't had in the past. So if industry is granted, the agricultural sector is granted those patent protection regimes, if it's granted the ability to create the kinds of scale of company, the mergers that they think are necessary, they argue are necessary, then they will get us through climate change. If they can't do that, if we're not allowed to have a merger between Dow and DuPont, or between Monsanto and Syngenta, or more likely ChemChina and Syngenta, or with BASF and Bayer, if those mergers can't take place, then we can't guarantee you that we can provide the scientific capacity and the creativity to get through climate change. And that pressure is intensely there, I think. And it's what may get them through some of these mergers if we don't fight back hard. And I'd like to come back to that maybe in discussion about what I think we can do to prevent those mergers, because I think they're actually quite possible. But the technologies that they're presenting as well are again, shocking as they propose these things in climate-smart agriculture. We saw last year more investments in research in food and agriculture, particularly in food systems, food processing, than we ever have ever before, and much greater than we've seen in most other sectors. I think only some investments in the pharmaceutical, some sectors of the pharmaceutical sector, and IT, of course, in the digital economy, are bigger than the investments in food processing last year. So we need to be watching for that, understanding what are they trying to do with that. The companies are claiming in this that again, this is the only way to do things, and that they are prepared to put in the money. And I really like the figures you're raising about what we say are the costs of the industrial chain. FAO's figures around the $2.5 trillion are figures that I think just relate to what they consider as food wastage in the system, and externalities around that. They've been forced into a narrow area trying to discuss about this because of the politics of FAO, I think. We've talked with folks at FAO. They actually will admit in some of the papers that are coming out, not supported by FAO, are actually putting the figure up to close to $5 trillion per year. So in the end, if you look at what the system is offering us now, and I like to approach technologies from that perspective, what the companies are saying to us is that, again, to get through climate change, we need them and their technologies. The industrial food chain is the only way to do it. What's being done in agroecology is cute, but it's not going to ever scale up. It can't really do the job. So because of that, you have to go with the industrial food chain. If you look at the cost of the industrial food chain, this year, Planet Retail tells us that they stick by their projections for 2015. They say that the expenditures last year for all commercial food globally was $7.56 trillion. Then if you look at, though, what FAO says was wasted in that, didn't make it to the table, you dropped that by about 40% as wasted. If you then look at what made it to the table but shouldn't have, because there was overconsumption causing additional costs of different kinds, you add on another 15% from the total bill, or something higher than that for their share, the share that's actually consumed. You end up with literally $3.5 trillion of the $7.5 trillion identified as wasted, as not productive for agriculture, or for people. And then on top of that, if you look at what are thought to be the environmental damages of the system, from fertilizer runoff and everything else we all know about, the greenhouse gas emissions and so on, you do come up with another $5 trillion in costs. So in fact, at the end of the day, what you look at is a food system which annually in the industrial food system costs us slightly over $12.5 trillion per year, of which only $7.5 trillion is really on the table to be seen easily. Within that, you still have half of that system damaging. In other words, you get about $3.5 trillion in value out of a $12.5 trillion system, cost system. The saving is roughly equivalent to 5 times global annual expenditure. Is equal to 5 times global annual expenditures in armaments. 5 times. It's $1.8 trillion, a little bit less than $1.8 trillion a year in armaments expenditures. So we have an industrial food system horrifically damaging to the environment, horrifically damaging to our health, not actually getting around to feeding people adequately or safely, that is a mess. And that's the system of innovation and creativity that we're going to go to get us through climate change. It makes no sense. It's simply illogical. We can go through the details, of course, of those figures and look at animal feeds and look at how much meat consumption there should be and how much of that should be called waste and how much shouldn't be called waste. It's a very complicated area. And one of the things you very quickly understand is that, in fact, the figures we use aren't very accurate, can't be very accurate, because everyone's kind of playing around with their interpretations of them. It was kind of fun, though, this morning to read the Financial Times and the UK and find that in their discussion they have a special section, as Juliette mentioned, on technologies, ethics of technology. And they say in one of the pieces on agriculture that, again, 70% of the world's food is grown by smallholder producers. Well, that's true, but it's probably a bit more than 70%. Their definition, again, what they mean by that, are they including fisher folk or not, and so on, gets complicated. But If we are in a world where we have an industrial food chain, which is wasting literally something like almost $9 trillion in value every year, causing damages of $9 trillion in value every year, and producing food that only really meets the needs of about 30% of the population, with vast amounts of resources involved, greenhouse gases and so on. And yet you have another system made up of smallholder producers that are actually producing 70% of the food that's on the table that people actually eat and need to eat. Then where do you put your energy? Where do you put your time? You go into the industrial chain saying, gee, we hope we give these guys a bit more money, we improve their patent protection, if we allow them to have the big cartels and so on, if we let them try CRISPR technologies and gene driver technologies and so on, and drones stuff and everything else, then maybe they'll get us through all this mess. I think we actually look at the system over its last 60 or 70 years and say, it hasn't worked. In fact, a system that only, after all that money, only gives us about 30% of the food we need, you've got to say, well, it's kind of interesting, but can it scale up? And the answer is, it's kind of too expensive, we can't afford it, and it can't scale up. So then, where do we go? And I think we do go towards the agroecology system. And the figures, again, are fun to look at, and I think that virtually all the figures I see in food and agriculture are dubious. So I'm not going to try to defend them to the detail at all, either theirs or mine. But I still think some of the basics indicate where we are. We have an industrial food system which today there are 103,000 and a bit more plant varieties that are under intellectual property protection. Of those 103,000 plant varieties under patent protection or patent rights in the world, 56% of them are ornamentals. They're not exactly eating people else. You want to eat orchids. So the research isn't really doing much. If you look at that, the research that's going into the research 103,000 plant varieties around the world, the research really shows you that almost all of it goes to 3 crops, 125 crops in total, and 45% of the research goes to 1 crop, corn. 45% of all the research. So are those guys going to get us through climate change? Not likely. They can't get there from here. If you look at the peasant food system, on the other hand, you have, and it's quite clear, peasants have donated, not patented, but donated to the food system since the 1960s, 2.1 million plant varieties of 7,000 different species, not 125, that are in the gene banks and are accessible and to be used by others. Of all the species that are in the gene bank that are agricultural species that can be used to grow food, of those species, 7,000 that are in the gene banks, 6,850 of them aren't even used by the private sector. They're only used by farmers. So if we're trying to look at diversity, how do we get ourselves protected against all the stresses of climate change that are coming down the road, then you've got to look to that system. You can't look to the industrial chain for that. You look at livestock, it's exactly the same for livestock. Figures just came out on Friday, which I haven't had a chance to go through from FAO closely for new livestock research, but basically they won't have changed very much. We have, again, a system where 5 species are produced by the industrial sector. We have, within those 5 species, about 100 breeds in total that are actually commercially used around the world. It's 100 breeds. On the farm side of that, on the peasant side of that, what we have is a system in which farmers are working with about just under 7,000, 6,800 or so breeds of livestock of, as far as we know, 40 species of domesticated animals. So 5 species versus 40 species, 100 breeds as opposed to 6,800 breeds, which is going to get us through climate change. It's pretty clear. And the nice thing about technologies, and I agree with Mark, that some of the things about technologies that are coming down the pipe are really fascinating and have real potential to do good in a good environment, in a good political environment. They have great use. Some of the information technologies, which allow farmers in different parts of the world to share information about diseases with each other, to share information about climatic conditions, soil conditions, to advise each other on what's working and what's not working with different plant varieties and livestock breeds and so on. That stuff is really exciting. The capacity to have hundreds of millions, literally, of researchers collaborating together and working with academics in the world as well, and the private sector in the world as well, to actually create constructive change is huge. Why would we ever go to the industrial food chain to help us make change at this point? It's just not credible. And we can go on from there. I can give you the same kinds of figures for livestock or for fisheries as for livestock in terms of ratios of what inshore fishermen do in small trawlers or small vessels compared to what the big trawlers do. We look at in terms of forest products and so on, forest diversity. It's the same. We have the industrial food chain, which has, since the 1970s, I think the three figures that shocked me the most, frankly, are these. One, they have reduced the genetic diversity of our species by 75% since the 1970s. This is FAO. And and by the way, that's 75% that's accessible to Western science. It's not that it's not accessible to some of the farmers themselves, but they haven't found it. It's not been protected by Western science, but 75% is estimated to have disappeared since the 1970s. Secondly, we've lost 30%, we've had an implosion of 36% of the species we consume. The other species are still there, they're still in the marketplace, you can still find them, but they're not used very much. So according to the Global Crop Diversity Trust, we've seen this last year, we've seen a 36% decline in what we actually do get around to eating in species. And thirdly, we've got this range, and we need to do a lot more research on this, but still the range says that if you look at what we are eating, the species that we are eating, the nutritional value of those species is declining has declined between 5% at the lowest end to 40% at the highest end. So less diversity, less species, and less nutrition. So on the basis of just generally these figures, there is simply no logic to saying, let's put our faith in the industrial food chain. Let's give them the patent protection they need. Let's give them the flexibilities they require. Let's allow them to have bigger corporations to get us through all this stuff. No. Enough is enough. They can't scale up. We need to create a system which works for peasants. And it's doable. And what we've seen in the last year is, of course, FAO has gone to unring us out.
No, you might keep going.
Well, let me go over.
I will let you go over.
Okay. We have a system where FAO, Graziano, the Director General of FAO, got himself trapped and agreed to an agroecology conference because the French government kind of conned him into it. And he went along with it, and then it kind of worked. And so he then got trapped into agreeing to 3 regional conferences. I know you've been at those, so it's, did you go all 3 of them?
2 of them in China, went to the 3rd.
Oh, great, okay. We went to one of them, I think, in the end. And so the regional conferences have been held. I think the overall feedback I've got from at least La Via Campesina and others has been that they really went well, better than expected for the most part. Maybe that's not true. The last one, I didn't hear as much about the Bangkok one. But progress is being made in this direction, rather encouraging progress. The reaction to that, of course, is an FAO, the response has been, led by the American government, is for every $1 you spend on agroecology, the FAO spend $5 on biotech. And that's where the money is now going inside FAO. We have a conference coming up February, I think it's 16th and 17th in Rome, where the biotech industry is coming to make its case. And so the pushback is clearly there. Frankly, I think it's going to be a fun meeting, because I think the industry is going to show up in the middle of February with all the talk of mergers swelling around it, and the questions of the quality of the innovation that's being done, and we can go spend more time on the quality of that innovation, because it's really dropping amazingly in terms of pesticides, for example, in terms of seeds. The quality is declining. We're going to be in a situation where they'll show up, I think, in an extremely embarrassed situation. And it will be a debacle for FAO and a rout for the industry. But the pressure still is coming back to that. And that's the kind of thing we need to be looking at during this year of agricultural biodiversity, is to make those kinds of challenges, not just making the case for the peasant food system, which is already feeding significantly more than 70% of those people at the end of the day. If you put it all together, we made those figures initially in 2009, I think. And it was interesting to see all the negative reactions to us saying 70% of the food is produced by peasants. And now, FAO, one thing is that FAO recently, they said it was 80%. Really got that figure. Nestle says it's 70%. The Financial Times says it's 70%. The Economist says it's 70%. I'm not sure any of us are right, but I'd say that we were wrong. It probably is. We'll have some figures out in the next few days even. There's going to be more than 75% of all the food that's actually consumed and needed is produced by peasants. Can I take a minute more just on some of the technologies, and then I'll stop. What we're faced now with is an approach towards technologies, which I think is going to mean that at the end of the day, in agricultural inputs, the dominant companies are going to be the farm machinery companies. I don't think we're going to see in the next few months John Deere buying Monsanto, though it might. Frankly, if I were the head of John Deere, I would buy Monsanto about now. But we are going to see a shift that way. There was an article, I can't remember the author now, it was Marx, but it wasn't the Marx we all know. In the 1960s, wrote an article titled, or a book titled, The Machine in the Garden.
Leo Marx.
Leo Marx, yes. Steve would know that. Now I think it's the box in the garden. At the end of the day, the winner is going to be the company that's got the box in which you put the seeds, the pesticides, and the fertilizers. It's attached to the drone flying overhead. It's ridden by robots anyways, and uses satellites as well, and sells you crop insurance as well. I think the crop insurance part of this is going to be important. And so whereas the pesticide companies are in fact losing enormously, and the costs are, but the figures that we use are to develop a new plant variety costs $136 million in the United States. $136 million. To develop a new pesticide costs $256 million in the United States. So it's still vastly cheaper to adapt the plant to the chemical than adapt the chemical to the plant. That's really important economic dynamics. And so, but the companies aren't investing in the pesticides. They're hoping to live off the back of the seeds. And they aren't doing well with the seeds these days, for all kinds of reasons, in terms of pollinators and everything else, and just not working. But now the move is to say, well, we can use gene drivers. We can actually again take a recessive trait, build a recessive trait that's detrimental to the species, to a mosquito or to any kind of bug, or fungicide, fungus or whatever. We can build a recessive trait into that species and let it loose, and it will multiply so rapidly that it'll become pervasive, ubiquitous, to that species in the course of literally a few years, sometimes even faster than that, and will kill off the species. So the focus now in the research is exactly that kind of technology, and the controls that can be applied around that. I mean, it's actually terrifying for agricultural biodiversity. So what you have then is an ability to not just attack in the field the pest that's bothering your crop, but actually to send your pesticide out over the fence, hop over the fence and go into the forests and go after it there. And spread to the wild relatives of that species. And spread to other species perhaps. And at this stage, there's no regulatory control over that. Not in Europe and not in the United States. It's being allowed as being perfectly acceptable. It's not called a GMO even. It's not technically a GMO in some sense of the word. And the battleground over the control of that technology, in terms of intellectual property rights, but also the battleground over the regulation of that technology, will probably play out. It won't be resolved entirely, but the crucial moment, the tipping point of whether or not that technology is allowed out into nature, unguarded, or is controlled, will be this year. It will be fought out in the Biodiversity Convention, which is taking it on. Actually is taking it on seriously. And we'll have meetings in April in Montreal and meetings in Cancun in December and so on. Could be taken on as well by FAO, by the Committee on World Food Security. It should be taken on by FAO. And is a technology which should be taken on, battled through in Brussels. I have not much hope for Washington, frankly, but I do think Brussels gives us an opportunity. And I think that's where it should be. The other battle I'd identify, and I'll stop talking with this, besides fighting that regulatory battle, which I think IATP has enormous capacities in. We have lots of strengths and understanding of this ways that, frankly, a sector group does not understand. The second area, which I think, again, for us, for IATP, is important as a sector group, because we don't have expertise in this area either, is looking at, again, the cartel practices. Because it is simply not logical to allow these mergers to take place among the biggest companies. Not logical if you are Brazil or in India or a China or in Argentina or in many other countries. Why would you allow that to come about, knowing that your national champions, your Embrapas or your ChemChinas, are damaged by that when it comes to their future aspirations? So you want to protect their interests. That's entirely selfish. Or because you know it'll increase subsidy costs at the farm level, probably, for at least some commodities. And thirdly, you know that it will have impacts in terms of innovation, because those companies don't innovate. It's a lot cheaper to invest in public relations talking about innovation than it is to actually put money into research and development, doing innovation. A lot cheaper to talk about, lots of money to be made there, not much money to be made in actually doing the research. And so knowing that innovation is going to be declining as well, there's a strong argument for Brazil particularly perhaps, China particularly perhaps, to say, we don't want this. And if those countries, if even any two of, I'd say, Brazil, India, China, Argentina, decide that they don't want these mergers to take place, they won't. It's not worth it for the shareholders. It's just, that's the emerging market. That's where the profits are going to be in the future. If you can't sell your seeds and pesticides into those markets, forget it. It's not a good deal. I think that argument can be made for all kinds of reasons. I think it's quite possible for us in civil society to actually make that change. And I'll end now just by pointing to one area that I'd like to have a chance to discuss at some point, which is, I think we are at a stage where not only do we need to be, well, I think perhaps most importantly, quite honestly, we need to be taking climate and trade and technologies together, looking at it in the context of agriculture in a much more careful way than we have in the past, for sure. And secondly, I think that we're at a stage where we need to make big changes. We need to make big differences, and we can. We are at a point where in this year, in this time, we can really affect the outcome of some of these negotiations in the ways we haven't been able to in the past. They are more vulnerable as an industry than they ever have been before. That's right. And we can do something about this. And that's why I would argue, and that was my final point, that with we've been, in the sector group, we've been chasing technologies for the last almost 40 years. We're terribly close to my 40th anniversary in this work with the sector group. And we've been ambulance chasing all of that time. We've been chasing GMOs, we've been chasing genetic diversity, we've been chasing biotech more broadly, geoengineering now, synthetic biology and so on, nanotechnology. Frankly, we need to stop chasing ambulances and creating a system in which we can be assessing technology both at the global UN level and at the civil society level, social movement level around the world, as a group, in a collective kind of way, not just in trade and so on as well, to understand them better. And I think we have in the last year created an environment in which there's at least 3 global initiatives on technology assessment, which can show to us that we have a way forward to stop chasing ambulances and try to really address them in a cohesive, logical manner, which does not destroy innovation, does not destroy the capacity for technology. We want that, but does create an environment in which we can at least do it somewhat safely and not begin in some sort of shock doctrine environment. Sorry I was so long.